The question was, what do I think the role is of the Christian or the church in addressing politics?
And that's the issue of the relationship of the church to state government.
Should Christians get involved in politics?
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. And if you've been listening for a while, you've heard David Lipscomb brought up in numerous previous episodes. Well, I came across an article not long ago from Lipscomb that I thought y'all might be interested in. It was published January 9th of 1866 in the Gospel Advocate. The Gospel Advocate is a religious magazine that has been continuously published since 1866. It was founded in 1855 by Tolbert Fanning, but was understandably put on a 5-year hiatus in 1861 during the American Civil War. So it started back up in 1866 with David Lipscomb filling in after his older brother William Lipscomb as co-editor. And it wasn't long before David Lipscomb became the sole editor. David Lipscomb became the most influential voice of the Church of Christ due to his 50 years of editing this journal. But within the Christian anarchist world, Lipscomb may be best known for his book on civil government. I've mentioned it several times for his writings about Romans 13. I will have links to the various Lipscomb and Romans 13 episodes and articles in the show notes. But today, we are going to go over something he printed in the Gospel Advocate. But real quick, I always have to give a disclaimer. Presenting this article is not in any way endorsing everything written in the Gospel Advocate, nor the denomination of the Church of Christ, or even David Lipscomb himself. But with that said, I think this article in particular poses some interesting observations and asks the reader to consider some very important points in the necessary question: what is the church's relationship to the state? So let's get into this article, The Church of Christ and World Powers, published by David Lipscomb in 1866. In the prospectus for the present volume of the Gospel Advocate, we announced our intention of examining the relation which the Church of Jesus Christ sustains to the world powers, civil, military, and religious, by which it is surrounded and with which it often comes in contact. On this, as on many other subjects, we are apt to imbibe the ideas and adopt the habits of those by whom we are surrounded in childhood, without ever questioning ourselves as to whether those ideas and customs are correct. Are they in accordance with the teachings of the great master? Now, Jesus Christ gave rules that will guide his children safely and securely according to his will, if they will only diligently hearken to those teachings. All Scripture given by inspiration of God is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. God has given us direction, how we should conduct ourselves in all the relationships of life as parent and child, husband and wife, master and servant, friend, enemy, neighbor, and stranger. He has certainly not left indefinite our duty in that relation, which is so liable to be used to control the whole man, soul, and body, time, talent, and energy as the world organizations under which we live. We ask you then, courteous reader, to calmly investigate with us the connection that Christ has established between his kingdom and the world powers, or institutions, that we may learn our duties with reference to them, and be prepared ever in this, as other matters, to be found walking according to the will of the Master. But for the present, we will content ourselves with merely stating the three leading positions of the religious world in reference to this subject. So that was the first paragraph of 5. I think I'll take a moment after each one to comment on something that stands out to me. In this opening paragraph, I like how he points out that we grow up with these ideas and teachings that we accept without even questioning. It's very similar to the question of growing up saying the Pledge of Allegiance and wondering how that shapes our opinions on the state. It's interesting to see that this sort of question was being asked in the late 1800s. So let's get into the first of the 3 ways he has identified that the church relates to the state. He continues, the first and most popular idea, taking the whole professed Christian world into consideration, is that the church should form alliances with the world institutions for the purpose of controlling and using those institutions for the advancement of its own interest. The member of the church, according to this idea, enter into these organizations not from the intrinsic value of these institutions, but that the interest of the church may be advanced. With this idea, when the interest of the church demand it, the identical institution will by the same power be destroyed. This idea we denominate the Roman Catholic idea. It is the ruling principle with the Roman Catholic Church. She approves no special form of human government, but allies herself with every form, as her interest may demand, or her influence thereby be extended. Her votaries worship at every political shrine and espouse antagonistic causes, yet never disturb the unity of their mother church. The same motive prompts the French Catholics to sustain the cause of France against Austria that prompts the Austrian Catholics to uphold the cause of Austria against France. The one object that moves each is the advancement of the interest of Mother Rome, the augmentation of her interest by giving her control of each government. She, in a sense peculiarly of her own, thus becomes all things to all men, Austrian to Austria, French to France, that she may gain both Austria and France to her support. This idea holds that there is nothing good or desirable in political institutions, farther than they may be used for the advancement of the church. So what do you think about the first form, which he called the Roman Catholic form of viewing the church and state? I think it's healthy to view the sincere motives within the church, as he seems to be doing here. After generations and generations of scandals, I think I'm not alone when I start to look at every political entanglement or religious power platform as personal gain, even at another's expense. But that doesn't mean everyone thinks that way. And breaking it down like this doesn't necessarily legitimize this church-state relationship, but it helps me sympathize with people that hold it with good intentions. In this current culture of political squabbling, it's easy to lose sight that people, even though they may be misled, could be sincere. All right. Position number 2. The next idea that we present holds that political governments are of divine origin, as such must be supported and sustained for their own intrinsic worth and because They are essential to the well-being not only of the world, but the church itself, and in many respects more essential to society than the church. This conception of the relationship existing between them changes the position of the two institutions, making the church subserve the interest of the state, making the state first, the church second. Church members enter into the contest, strifes, animosities, and partisanships of the state because their first, highest duty is there. The chief interest of society is embodied therein. With this idea, all church harmony depends upon political unity. This condition of affairs makes the church the tool of the political clique, at once the victim and fosterer of the sectional prejudice and a party to the national conflicts. We denominate this idea the Protestant idea. Protestantism has its birth in the rebellion of the political rulers of England, Germany, and Switzerland against the assumption of Rome to control them for the benefit of the church, assisted, it is true, by a religious reformation excited by Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. Each branch of Protestantism received its peculiar embodiment from the nature and interest of the national government with which it allied itself. English Protestantism differed widely from German, and Swiss from both. This view of the relationship of church and state pervades all the denominations of Protestant Christendom. We may solely affirm that not one of these has ever been able to maintain its unity intact, its harmony of feeling and action undisturbed, when two nations in which that church existed was engaged in strife, or even when political partisanship or sectional excitement ran high in any one government. Hence, when the United States separated from England politically, the Church of England in this country and England served in twain. Also, in the sectional and political strifes in our own country, sectional animosity and bitterness ran fully as high in the religious bodies even before it did in the body politic. I think his insight in what he is calling the Protestant view is spot on. Again, even with sincere motivations, we can absolutely see how the church becomes subservient to the state, and the involvement in the state from the church members becomes the first priority. I don't think I need to dwell on this much because it seems self-evident. The American Revolution was heavily influenced by Protestantism, and during that time, it was referred to by the British as a religious war and a Presbyterian rebellion. From then on, the dominant denomination in the United States has always been Protestant. So, looking back on Lipscomb's words, it makes sense to draw this connection and to see the many examples today of the results of this church-state relationship that he points out. All right, on to point 3 of 3. There is yet another view of this relationship that we desire to present. A view individuals in all ages of the church, from the day of Jesus Christ to the present time, have maintained that the two institutions, the Christian and the worldly, were necessarily separate and distinct, that they could form no alliances, that each was necessary in its proper place and from its proper subjects, that God's institution, or the church, was perfect and needed no help or addition from human hands to enable it to direct the affairs of its own children. On the other hand, that God had left those who refused to submit to his government to form a government to their own liking, to manage it according to their own views of propriety and for the accomplishment of their own desired ends. And with this, Christians have nothing to do farther than God has connected them with it. The limit and bound of which connection is a quiet submission to its requirements, when these do not conflict with their obligations to God. In a word, that the Christians cannot become the partisan of any human government or institution. It is his duty to submit to all alike, and with fidelity as to God himself, comply with the requirements of whatever one he may be under, modified by his first duty to obey God unto death rather than any man power. But it is not his province to become an active participator or partisan of any human government or form of government. Anyone that has spent some time in episodes involving Lipscomb in Romans 13 will find this a cohesive statement. He didn't have a denominational name for this position, but I like to call it the tool position, that is, viewing governments as God's tool. With that comes the implication that we do not worship tools, we don't sing hymns to tools and participate in the apotheosis of the tool. With that comes this separation of the church and state that he's referring to. In the church, there's usually a negative opinion of the phrase separation of church and state, as it's usually proclaimed by the various atheist or anti-religious organizations. But if a Christian takes this position, they will find themselves seemingly standing by with the non-theist, agreeing that there should be a separation between the church and the state. And that would include individual Christians, as the church isn't just a collectivist term. It is also referring to the individuals within it. If the church can't do something, that means Christians can't do something. Further support for the individual Christian staying out of the state is found with viewing Romans 13 through this lens, and additionally Romans 12. Because I've gone over Romans 13 a lot, and I'll have links to our episodes in the show notes, so I won't get into a deep dive here, but I will say that the general idea is that Romans 12 describes the characteristics of a Christian, and Romans 13 describes the characteristics of the state. Give it a quick read when we are done here, and I'm sure you will see how they are incompatible. So let's finish up with Lipscomb's closing paragraph. He continues his thoughts on the third position, the separate church and state. This idea, prevailing in a church and acted upon, will at once render that church free from discords and strifes on political grounds. It causes the Christian in England to submit to the government of England, not because he approves that government, but because God requires him to submit to it. It causes the Christian in Mexico to submit to the Republic of Mexico when under the Republic, not because he approves a republic or is a Republican, but because God says to be subject to the powers that be. It requires him to turn to submit to the Empire of Mexico when an empire is established, not because he is a monarchist or a partisan in the empire, but because God says submit to the powers that be, not the ones that ought to exist or that he prefers, but to the ones that actually do exist. These three ideas of the connection of the kingdom of Jesus Christ with the world powers and institutions, with their modifications, embrace the faith and practice of the professed Christian world on this subject. These ideas direct the actions of their respective advocates and exercise a wonderful effect upon the course and destinies of those churches. Will our readers ponder these questions in their bearing upon the peace, purity, unity, and destiny of the Church of Jesus Christ and the well-being of the world? And with us examine the sacred scriptures to see which, if any of them, be true positions assigned to the Church by its divine founder. So that's it. What did you think of the three relationships of the church to the state? Do you think Lipscomb was right in his observations and the results from each one? Lipscomb would go on to make 17 more articles for the Gospel Advocate, digging deeper into these distinctions between Christianity and the state. I will have the original Gospel Advocate article posted on Anarcho-Christian and linked in the show notes. as well as the link to the entire Volume 8 that contains all 18 of Lipscomb's articles on the Church of Christ and world powers. But one more thing before we close out. I've taken some heat before for using the church in a collectivist way that includes all of the terrible things that self-professing Christians have done. On one hand, some people only want to use the term the church for the righteous and faithful, while on the other hand, we are including people that most would say are outside of that. I want to briefly mention that there is precedence in the church and church history for using the term the church in this way that includes people that do not comply or affirm standard Christian morality or orthodox confessions. There is a history of different ways to distinguish these two, yet still identifying both under the larger banner of the church. Some say inner or outer church. Some say church visible and church invisible. The outer or visible church being anyone that affirms being a Christian. Yet the inner or invisible church being those who are saved and regenerate, which only God knows. So in case anyone has been a little uneasy with my use of this the church term in a negative way, I'd like to read a passage from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. I think it is really the best and most concise explanation of this. So here we go. John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 4, Chapter 1, Paragraph 7. The judgment which ought to be formed concerning the visible church, which comes under our observation, must, I think, be sufficiently clear from what has been said. I have observed that the Scriptures speak of the church in two ways. Sometimes, when they speak of the church, they mean the church as it really is before God. The church into which none are admitted, but those who by the gift of the adoption are sons of God, and by the sanctification of the Spirit, true members of Christ. In this case, it not only comprehends the saints who dwell on earth, but all the elect who have existed from the beginning of the world. Often, too, by the name of church, is designated the whole body of mankind scattered throughout the world, who profess to worship one God in Christ, who by baptism are initiated into the faith, by partaking of the Lord's Supper profess unity in true doctrine and charity, agree in holding the word of the Lord, and observe the ministry which Christ has appointed for the preaching of it. In this church, there is a very large mixture of hypocrites who have nothing of Christ but the name and outward appearance, of ambitious, avaricious, envious, evil-speaking men, some also of impurer lives, who are tolerated for a time, either because their guilt cannot be legally established, or because due strictness of discipline is not always observed. Hence, as it is necessary to believe the invisible church, which is manifested to the eye of God only, so we are also enjoined to regard this church, which is so called, with reference to man, and to cultivate its communion. All right, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I know that's a lot to think on between that passage from Calvin and this article from David Lipscomb, but it's good stuff to think on. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find the links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Thank you, Jesse and Terrence, for being our newest patrons. I really appreciate your support. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
The question was, what do I think the role is of the Christian or the church in addressing politics?
And that's the issue of the relationship of the church to state government.
Should Christians get involved in politics?
Individuals in all ages of the church, from the day of Jesus Christ to the present time, have maintained that the two institutions, the Christian and the worldly, were necessarily separate and distinct, that they could form no alliances, that each was necessary in its proper place and from its proper subjects, that God's institution, or the church, was perfect and needed no help or addition from human hands to enable it to direct the affairs of its own children. On the other hand, that God had left those who refused to submit to his government to form a government to their own liking, to manage it according to their own views of propriety and for the accomplishment of their own desired ends. And with this, Christians have nothing to do farther than God has connected them with it, the limit and bound of which connection is a quiet submission to its requirements, when these do not conflict with their obligations to God.